The responsibility to intellectuals. The Chomskyan Inversion. The following essay contains its own contradiction. It demands endurance from a public it simultaneously diagnoses as having lost the capacity for such endurance. It asks for sustained engagement from readers it suspects will either consume it as performance or reject it as elitist. In making these demands, it risks becoming another artifact of the very problem it names: intellectual work that circulates as cultural capital rather than catalyzing actual thought. Perhaps this recursion is inescapable. Every serious intellectual intervention faces the same bind. It must use the deteriorated channels of public discourse to argue for their renovation. It must appeal to capacities it simultaneously claims have atrophied. This isn't a flaw in the argument, but a feature of our predicament. The question, then, isn't whether this essay escapes the dynamic it describes. It doesn't. The question is whether naming the dynamic with sufficient precision creates any possibility for interruption. Not through sudden transformation, but through the accumulation of moments where someone chooses endurance over ease, sits with discomfort rather than seeking immediate resolution, or recognizes their own refusal in the mirror this essay holds up. If even that hope proves naive, then this essay becomes diagnostic rather than prescriptive. A record of how civilizations lose their capacity for self-correction, written from within that loss. I want to begin by accepting the moral clarity of Noam Chomsky's, the responsibility of intellectuals, rather than disputing it. Chomsky is right to insist that those with access to information, analytic capacity, and proximity to power carry a heightened obligation to expose lies, dismantle euphemism, and refuse service to organized violence. His essay remains one of the most disciplined indictments of intellectual cowardice in the modern canon. Yet, embedded within this argument is an assumption so fundamental that it disappears from view: that there exists a public capable of receiving what the responsible intellectual is obligated to say. Chomsky writes as if truth, once spoken clearly and courageously, enters a social field, prepared to contend with it. But the social field itself carries a responsibility, one that precedes persuasion, agreement, and even understanding. When that responsibility collapses, intellectual courage becomes performative at best, self-sacrificial at worst. Truth does not fail because it is suppressed alone. It fails because it is no longer hosted. This essay argues that the responsibility Chomsky assigns to intellectuals cannot be sustained unless the average person accepts a prior obligation: responsibility to intellectual labor itself. Not deference, not obedience, but endurance, the willingness to sit with ideas that do not console, to tolerate critique that destabilizes identity, and to resist the demand that thought justify itself through immediate gratification. We inhabit a moral economy that systematically denies this obligation. The cultural machinery rewards figures whose primary function is emotional regulation, icons of dominance, luxury, transgression, or escape, while those who insist on complexity become structurally irrelevant. This is not manipulation imposed from above, it is preference enacted from below, a collective decision to choose reassurance over understanding. The mechanism operates through substitution. When intellectual discomfort becomes unbearable, societies don't simply reject thought. They replace it with surrogates that perform its social functions without its destabilizing effects. Wealth simulates wisdom, visibility masquerades as value, spectacle stands in for substance. These substitutes are emotionally legible and immediately consumable, which makes them infinitely easier to elevate than the slow, often painful work of comprehension. This dynamic proves most corrosive in communities shaped by historical deprivation. Here, aspiration compresses into narrow channels. Visibility and accumulation become the only recognized metrics of dignity. Intellectual work, with its demands for interior reckoning, appears not as care but as betrayal. The thinker who interrogates communal narratives from within is experienced as attacking the very defenses that made survival possible. Consider the fate of Black intellectual tradition in America. Figures like Du Bois, Baldwin, and Fanon were not rejected for lacking commitment to liberation. They were resisted because they insisted liberation begins with interior work, refusing to translate freedom into mere reversal of power or dignity into spectacle. Their demand for discipline before triumph has never been popular. What replaced their vision wasn't neutrality but a more comfortable substitute. Success measured by who escapes rather than how the community thinks. This reveals a deeper symmetry Chomsky leaves unexplored. Intellectuals betray truth when they serve power. The public betrays truth when it demands that truth serve comfort. These are not independent failures, but mutually constitutive ones. A public unwilling to endure difficulty trains intellectuals to either soften their insights into palatable brands or withdraw into irrelevance. The intellectual who speaks into a void does not remain unchanged. That void exerts deforming pressure toward simplification, theatricality, or despair. Over time, even sincere thinkers learn which insights will circulate and which will vanish. They discover when to soften, when to entertain, when to flatter. The line between responsibility and relevance blurs. The public then points to this degradation as evidence that intellectuals were never trustworthy, completing the circle of mutual corruption. What's at stake here exceeds critical thinking in its shallow popular sense, that reflexive suspicion of authority that flatters autonomy while eroding seriousness. The responsibility in question demands something harder: patience with incompleteness, restraint in judgment, and recognition that not every truth arrives as empowerment. It requires distinguishing between resistance, which can sharpen thought, and refusal, which starves it. Hannah Arendt warned that the greatest political dangers arise not from fanaticism alone, but from thoughtlessness, the erosion of habits that make judgment possible. A public that cannot tolerate sustained thinking doesn't remain neutral. It becomes administrable. Its moral vocabulary shrinks. Its imagination gets colonized by whatever is loudest, simplest, most emotionally gratifying. In such conditions, power doesn't need to silence intellectuals. It only needs to out-entertain them. The spectacle doesn't suppress truth. It renders it obsolete. Governance by manipulation becomes not just possible, but inevitable when publics outsource their judgment to systems with no interest in their flourishing. This is why elevating wealth and celebrity over intellectual seriousness signals more than cultural decline. It marks epistemic retreat. When success is measured primarily through accumulation and visibility, thinking becomes ornamental. The figures most rewarded are those who confirm the fantasy that escape is individual rather than collective, external rather than internal, spectacular rather than slow. Yet the persistence of resentment toward intellectuals reveals something crucial. Thought still threatens. It still presses on unresolved contradictions, asks questions that consumption cannot answer, demands recognitions that performance cannot satisfy. The task isn't to shame the public into reverence, but to name the cost of refusing that pressure. One might object that this places impossible weight on ordinary people, already burdened by economic pressure and structural injustice. But this misunderstands the responsibility being named. This isn't a call for everyone to become an intellectual. It's a call to resist the cultural reflex that treats thought as luxury rather than necessity. The burden isn't mastery but orientation, choosing not to starve the very capacities required to understand one's condition. When provisional adaptations to scarcity harden into permanent cultural forms, intellectual labor becomes suspect precisely because it threatens to reopen questions people have sealed for psychological survival. But mistaking survival tactics for destiny ensures that errors persist. not because they're unseen, but because naming them requires a tolerance for discomfort that no longer exists. Responsibility, in this sense, isn't a moral badge, but a structural necessity. Intellectuals are responsible for speaking truth without allegiance to power. The public is responsible for sustaining the space where such speech can matter, by listening when it's inconvenient, resisting the urge to punish complexity, and valuing understanding over reassurance. Neither can substitute for the other. When one fails, both collapse. The question isn't whether intellectuals matter in principle. Societies happily canonize thinkers once their danger has passed. The question is whether they're allowed to matter while still alive, still speaking, still capable of intervening. Posthumous reverence is cheap. Living endurance is costly. Intellectuals are routinely ignored, then misquoted, then ritualized, then safely embalmed. Their sharpest claims get sanded into slogans. Their most unsettling insights become aesthetic sensibilities or historical curiosities. This isn't respect, but containment, celebrating thinkers abstractly while refusing to engage them concretely. Many societies have quietly decided they no longer want the kind of truth intellectuals provide. Not because it's false, but because it interferes with preferred narratives of innocence, grievance, or destiny. The marginalization of intellectual life isn't accidental, it's defensive. A culture that cannot distinguish critique from contempt will always experience its thinkers as hostile. A culture that confuses affirmation with care will experience discipline as violence. Under these conditions, the intellectual becomes a mascot, useful for quotations and retrospective validation, but stripped of authority to disturb the present. What breaks this cycle isn't agreement, but seriousness. A willingness to let ideas unfold without demanding immediate payoff. A refusal to confuse discomfort with harm. A recognition that intellectual friction often signals that identity is being asked to mature rather than merely validated. Before intellectuals can fulfill their responsibility to truth, the public must fulfill its responsibility to the conditions of truth. This responsibility is exercised in daily choices about how attention is distributed, how status is assigned, how disagreement is metabolized, and how quickly complexity gets dismissed in favor of reassurance. If this responsibility is refused, the outcome isn't merely ignorance, but substitution. Power fills the vacuum left by neglected thought, then justifies itself by pointing to the absence it helped create. Governance by manipulation becomes inevitable when thinking is treated as optional. Chomsky was right to demand courage from intellectuals, but courage alone cannot carry a culture. Without a public willing to endure, the weight of thinking, without collective willingness to be unsettled before being soothed, intellectual responsibility becomes a monologue addressed to an empty room. The responsibility of intellectuals doesn't end with publication. The responsibility of the public doesn't end with consumption. Between them lies the fragile terrain where truth either takes root or withers. Whether that terrain is cultivated or abandoned is a question answered daily in what we elevate, what we ignore, and what we are willing to endure in the pursuit of understanding. For the minds that are ready,